Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Selling Greenville, your favorite real estate podcast here in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm your host, as always, Stan McCune, realtor right here in the Greenville area, and you can find all of my contact information in the show notes if you need to reach out to me for any of your real estate needs. And just a reminder, as always, if you like this content, please like, rate, review, subscribe to the show to make sure you don't miss future episodes. And if you need homeowners insurance or if you think you might be getting charged too much for it, please contact Piper Insurance Group. Their contact information is in the show notes as well. They provide home, auto, and umbrella insurance for anyone in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. So all three of those states are independent. So they can give you the best price based on your needs from multiple different carriers. They're not just locked into one specific insurance carrier. They can even help you with investment properties, such as fix and flips, rentals, commercial properties, ground up new construction, all of those sorts of things. So go to the contact info for Piper Insurance Group and get a free quote from them today. Today I want to talk about a class that I took recently. Well, not specifically about the class, but some things from the class that I think will be interesting with regard to real estate negotiation. Negotiating is something that we're constantly doing. In fact, there was one thing that was said in the class that I really liked, which was that you don't get what you deserve. And I'll probably come back to this later in the episode, but it said you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. And isn't that the truth, right? You go to any company, for instance, in the corporate world, it doesn't matter how hard you work for that company and what you deserve to be paid for that company. If you don't stand your ground and negotiate a fair wage for yourself, you're not going to get it. Now, of course, some companies out there, they don't negotiate. And at that point, your only negotiating tool is to potentially walk away and go to another job. And a lot of people end up doing that. But this is true in real estate. You've got to negotiate everything or else you don't get anything. Now, to back up for a second, I mentioned that I had a class about this. I've actually had multiple classes in recent weeks that were optional, but I'm always trying to better myself as an agent. So I took one class that was an accredited buyer's representative course, a 12-hour course, so 6 hours per day for 2 days. And that was an in-person class. And then I took the real estate negotiation expert course, which was a Zoom class. That was strangely an 8-hour class, but it took 16 hours to complete. So I was in Zoom for 8 hours a day for 2 days, and I was about to die. The class was great, but just being on a Zoom call for 8 hours is just kind of draining. It was just kind of insane. But it was a very good course taught by someone who has extensive background in negotiation, was trained at Harvard in negotiating, and then has extensive corporate world experience in negotiating, and also in real estate as well. This person is currently a real estate, in addition to being a trainer, they're a real estate agent as well. And so a lot of really useful information. Some of it I felt like is kind of common sense, right? If you've been in real estate as long as I have, and I've been in real estate for about 9 years now, you couldn't survive in real estate that long without some sort of ability to negotiate. So I was glad and also not surprised that a lot of what he said was like, oh yeah, I've been kind of doing that subconsciously, but it was still helpful for me to actually break it down and think through the mechanics of real estate negotiating and how it all works. But there was one particular part of the course that I liked, and that was when they broke down everyone into 4 main types of negotiators. We're going to come back to that here in a second, but I just want to think about this one thing that honestly I didn't even talk about in the course, but that I think is really important. And that is, typically in a negotiation, it's a one-on-one thing, right? You're negotiating with one other party. But in real estate, there is sometimes 4 or more, usually 4 or more negotiators. You've got the buyer, you've got the seller, you've got the buyer's agent, you've got the listing agent. And they may each have different negotiating styles, and all of these play a role in the transaction. And these things are very important to understand when you are negotiating a real estate transaction, because they're all going to have different styles. Every party is going to have a different style. The agent style might be very different than the style of the person they're representing. Sometimes that comes out in a negotiation. And so I think it's interesting to talk through these different styles, what the pros and cons of them are, and how it works for realtors having their own negotiating styles while their clients might have a different way of negotiating. And I think, again, it's very important to remember that everyone negotiates. If you're going back and forth with your kid about nap time, or as I have to do frequently at night, negotiating with my dog about going to the bathroom right before bedtime, these are all negotiations that are happening constantly. And real estate is just another thing where negotiating happens. The difference is that, real estate agents are supposed to be experts at negotiating. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. But oftentimes their clients think that they are experts in negotiating, and oftentimes they are not. That being said, I will say I've had some clients that are very good at negotiating. For one reason or another, oftentimes they come from backgrounds that involve heavy negotiating at work or whatever the case may be. And so some of this information might be remedial to some of my listeners, but I think what I will be discussing here over the next 20 minutes or so will be useful even for those who have some kind of professional negotiation background. Okay, so let's talk about the 4 types of negotiators to start. And of course, this is based on the content provided by the National Association of Realtors. I know there's a gazillion negotiating books out there that break these down into other sorts of subtypes. But from the standpoint of real estate, I felt like these 4 types were very accurate. And so they essentially broke it down into 4 quadrants that were basically, you've got feelers and thinkers, right? On the top and the bottom, feelers on the bottom, thinkers on the top. And then you had introverts and extroverts, depending on what side of the spectrum you're on there. And so you've got these 4 quadrants, whether you're introverted, extroverted, feeling, or thinking. And the introverts tend to be slower and more patient. The extroverts tend to be more fast and or impatient. And so when you put all of these together, you get 4 different types depending on what quadrant you're in. The introverted thinkers, the extroverted thinkers, the introverted feelers, the extroverted feelers. Now, there was a whole process in the class whereby we determined which quadrant class participants fell in, and I'm not going to go through that on this episode, but you can probably get a sense where you might be based on my descriptions, right? Are you more introverted? Are you more extroverted? Are you more of a thinker? Are you more of a feeler? Now, what am I? I'm more of that extroverted thinker, which put me in the category of being a driver. So let's go through this for a second. Extroverted thinkers, that's the upper right-hand quadrant. They're drivers. They're controlling. They're decisive. They're impatient. They're results-driven. That's the way I am. Not with my clients. I'm not impatient or decisive or controlling with my clients. But in terms of the transaction, I'm very much that way. The introverted thinker, that is the analytical person. They're process-focused. They're logic-driven. They're skeptical. They're objective. They're going to be slow in terms of assessing different deals, different opportunities. And that's the way they are. They're the analytical type. Then you've got, right underneath them, the introverted feelers. They are the amiable negotiators. They tend to be conflict avoidant, relationship driven, very consistent, very loyal. They're not going to rock the boat. They're not going to come in with a hard and fast negotiation. Their negotiation style is going to be focused on the other person and trying to make everyone feel good at the end of the negotiation. And then you've got in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got the extroverted feelers. Those are the expressives. The expressives like recognition. They are not detail-oriented in any way, typically. Even if they think they are. This is a funny one. Sometimes you've got expressives that think they're detail-oriented, and they're really not. I've run into that a lot, and that's because they're talking a lot. They've got a lot of opinions out there, so they've got opinions about themselves, and they might have an opinion that they are very detailed, but they're not. I've already mentioned they talk a lot. Yes, they're emotionally driven. All of those things. So there you go. Drivers, analyticals, amiables, and expressives. Those are the 4 negotiating types. Now, I already mentioned I'm a driver. If you want to get more specific, I am an analytical driver. And so let's talk about drivers for just a second. I'll just start by saying this. A lot of realtors are drivers. This is a very common type of negotiator for my profession. Because I think it's pretty logical. If you aren't controlling and results oriented on some level, you're probably going to just get bulldozed over in a negotiation by others who are more aggressive than you, right? That makes sense. And the vast majority of my investor clients are also drivers. Sometimes non-investor clients will also be drivers, but those are usually people who are either really high up the corporate ladder or have sales jobs that involve a lot of intense negotiating, right? It's typically, at least in my experience, my clients that are drivers tend to be more of the investors, unless they are kind of more those high level business executives that are driving just naturally. They don't even know that they're doing it. Now, what I love about drivers is their decisiveness. They can oftentimes walk into a house and within a few minutes or sometimes even a few seconds know if they like it or not. And they also have very clear expectations, right? Just get the job done. Just find me the house that I want or just sell my house. Just get it done. I don't need a lot of small talk. I don't need a lot of chit chat. I don't need excuses. I just need results. And they usually know what they want and just expect you to deliver it for them. And as a result, success or failure is really easy to measure. And I like that about drivers. I like to be able to measure my own success or failure. However, drivers have their flaws when it comes to just in general with their personality and with regard to negotiating, right? Sometimes they can be too decisive and not think through a decision fully before making up their mind. And this is where, when my client is a driver, I really try to slow him or her down and make them fully understand the decision that they're about to make and the consequences of it. So I'm kind of, even though I'm not negotiating with my client, I'm negotiating their expectations and their processes, right? And my main concern with the driver is that they will make a decision too hastily and then regret it at some point. And this can happen on the buy side, but also on the sell side of a transaction, right? On the buy side, they jump too quickly into, loving a home. On the sell side, they might want to accept an offer right away that I don't personally think is the best decision for them at the time. And so in those instances, I might encourage them, hey, I think this might be a situation where you might want to hold off or perhaps counter the offer that you have rather than simply accepting it so that you can keep driving and keep moving forward. Drivers also tend to think they're better negotiators than everyone else. I've kind of already alluded to this. And what I haven't said earlier in this episode is that sometimes I run into situations where driver clients want to try to coach me on how to negotiate a real estate transaction, sometimes even telling me specific words to say. The problem with this is that they don't know who I'm negotiating with. Now, in the old school of negotiating, used a one-size-fits-all approach and just rammed that one-size-fits-all approach down the throats of whomever it was you were negotiating with. But these days, negotiation training is more about trying to make both parties feel like they're in a win-win situation than making one party feel like they have to lose for you to win. And so at the end of the day, you need to know the other party to know how to negotiate. And so when my clients tell me how to negotiate something, I listen politely and take their advice to heart. But having their best interest in mind may mean that while I attempt to reflect their energy and wishes to the other party, I might not use the exact wording that they are recommending. And I'm never going to commit to them to use the exact wording that they recommend. And actually, what's funny is there was one time I had a driver client who told me the exact words they wanted me to say to another agent. And of course, this was an agent that was into texting. They did not want to have phone call communications. And so the client was so adamant on how I needed to handle this negotiation that I literally used the exact wording that they told me, texted it, and naturally the negotiation didn't work out because it was just never going to work out, right? My client that insisted that I use specific wording, they didn't know what this other agent was like. The other agent didn't respond well to what they had to say. And then when my client was upset about it, I simply showed them the messages and said, hey, I said exactly what you told me to say. And naturally, their response was, well, I didn't mean for you to come across that way, but I literally just used their exact wording. So how else was it supposed to come across? And so, again, this is where drivers, I've found, even sometimes they will say they want you to do something, but they don't even necessarily mean it. Really, they're just trying to figure out how to get the results that they want, and perhaps they have an inflated opinion on how they can negotiate their own way into getting those results. Now, when I'm negotiating with another agent who's a driver, I'm not going to spend a lot of time buttering them up, right? Some agents, you need to do that. But generally speaking with drivers, you don't need to do that. They don't need it. They don't want it. Instead, I'm going to really focus on details and specifics that could make them feel good about the negotiation one way or another. Just get down to the meat and potatoes, right? That's what a driver wants. No chit chat. Just tell me what I need to know in order to keep my momentum going. Now, if you stay on the extroverted side of the quadrant, but move from thinkers to feelers, right? Because we've been in that thinking extroverted area, which is the drivers. Now we're moving down to the feeling extroverted area. You get the expressive type of negotiator, the expressive personality, and the expressives tend to be one of the more challenging ones for me personally, because I can get frustrated rehashing, quite frankly, over and over again, conversations that we've had about things that we've already discussed so many times in the past. And this is expressives. They like to just talk and revisit and revisit and retalk. And at the end of the time, what I run into very often with expressives is that they can struggle with committing to something because they're more impulsive than decisive. And that's really, really an important distinction in my opinion. A person who is impulsive, they make a decision without thinking about it. A person who is decisive, they have the ability to make a quick snap decision based on limited information. That's a completely different thing. Well, expressives tend to be more impulsive than decisive. They're not making decisions based on limited information. They're just making an impulse decision, essentially, regardless of the information that is presented. So when I have an expressive client, I am very concerned about the possibility that they may make a decision too quickly and then immediately change their mind due to being impulsive. So drivers also can make quick decisions that I'm trying to slow them down. But this is a little bit different. This is more of, I'm not just trying to slow them down. I'm trying to make them actually stop and think about their decision and be decisive rather than impulsive. But I also have to balance this with the possibility that they may make an emotional decision on the flip side to reject something. For instance, a seller might reject a good offer, or a buyer might reject a house that fits everything that they've told me that they want or need. And then down the road, they'll regret rejecting those things that they rejected simply out of impulse for one reason or another. And this is a really key difference between drivers and expressive. Drivers hardly ever look back and regret a decision. They're always just looking forward for the most part. Expressives, on the other hand, they will relive a decision over and over again, sometimes agonizing over a decision that they were so confident about just a few days earlier. That being said, at the end of the day, some of my most satisfying transactions by far in my career have been when my client wasn't expressive, because they communicate so much and they give so much feedback that I can find what they want oftentimes more easily than with my reserved clients, because I've got more conversations, more data to work off of. And usually at some point, even if they are impulsive, I'll be able to pick up on what impulses are driving them more than people that aren't communicating what's going on in their head. Maybe with an expressive curb appeal might be a bigger deal to them than it is to others. Maybe they're in love with a certain architectural style, etc. If I can figure out what those patterns are, I can usually provide great value to them, helping them find the homes that match what they seem to react to best, because I've got the information from them. I've been able to glean information from communicating with them. And so with expressives, a lot of listening is required. And so I really try to be a listening ear and a soundboard to them. And I want to, at the end of the day, be a neutral party that can help them negotiate their own headspace and understand what it is that they actually want. Because a lot of times with expressives, they don't even know what they want. They just have a lot of ideas and a lot of words that they're bouncing around, and eventually they'll kind of figure it out along the way, but they need someone to come alongside of them and help them negotiate all of these feelings and all of these thoughts that they have, and that's some of the value that a realtor can provide. Now, this can be especially true with expressive realtors, and there's a lot of them. This might be maybe the main quadrant of realtors, is this expressive side, this heavy on feelings, heavy on extroversion. Often an expressive realtor will call me just to vent about what's happening in a transaction. Or if I call them with a question that should only take a minute to get a response, I might need to endure a 30-minute conversation with them, telling me a whole lot of stuff that I really don't need to know without me being able to get a word in edgewise. And so with them, I found that the key for them when I'm negotiating with an expressive realtor is for them to feel heard while I then help them to see the big picture. So I might say something like, oh, wow, you feel like my client is being really aggressive? Okay, I can see how you might feel that way, but please, you need to understand that they're cash strapped. They have a baby on the way. This is a very stressful time for them. I can assure you from my conversations with them that they are not trying to be overly aggressive. So what can we do to make your client feel better about where this transaction is heading, right? I'm letting them know I hear them, but also helping them to try to see the big picture. Expressives need to feel like they are the ones. This is an interesting thing I've noticed over and over again. They need to feel like they're the ones ending the negotiation or the conversation, right? Even if I, quote unquote, win the negotiation, which again, that's the old way of thinking about it. Really, we had to have a good negotiation in real estate. We need to play the long game. We need both parties to feel like they're winning something, or else, I'm going to struggle to do business with this person down the road. And believe it or not, Greenville is still a small enough market that, maybe you as a buyer or a seller, you're like, well, I don't care if you need to do business with this person in the future. You need to do business with me first. But you might have to do business with them in the future if you're a buyer or a seller. I can't tell you how many times a buyer or a seller has had to deal on the other side of the table with the same agent that they've dealt with in the past. It does happen because we're in a smaller market here. And so I need to, at the end of the day, make that expressive person feel like they're the ones that kind of get that last word in edgewise. And so this involves a lot of patience to make sure that they get out of each interaction what they are looking for, even if it may be a longer conversation than I feel like is needed. I've also found that expressives don't always want facts so much as they just want to sense confidence, right? They'll ask questions like, do you think this is a good deal? Well, as a realtor, those are very, very difficult questions to answer because it's so subjective, right? It might not be a good deal to one person, but it might be a great deal to someone else. So if I answer, well, it depends, or if I say something like what I just said, well, it might be a good deal to you, or it might be a good deal to someone else, or it might not, expressives are just going to ignore the rest of what I say because all that they're looking for is confidence in the answer, more so than what my actual answer, what the actual words is I use. So I really need to assess closely what expressive clients or agents have revealed to me up to that point to try to give them a confident answer to their question that doesn't push them in a direction that they don't want to go in, right? Because that's certainly not what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to push a client to make a decision they don't want to make. I'm just trying to help them find out and figure out what that decision is that they actually want to make. And this is more challenging than you might think. So is this a good deal? To come back to that question, the way I'll likely answer it is something like, well, it's a great deal for someone looking for a mid-century modern in this area because the last one that came up on the market sold for X amount, right? That puts more specificity to my answer while also helping me avoid the trap of answering a vague question with a vague answer that could push a client in the wrong direction. It's also not so specific that it could push them in the wrong direction as well. It's not like I'm saying, wow, yeah, this is an incredible deal. I would for sure buy it if I were you. I'm hedging it. I'm explaining, well, it's a good deal within these specific parameters. And I want to make sure that they know that. And then how do they respond to that? How do they express after getting that information? And then I'm going to reassess things after that. Same thing when I'm dealing with the agents. I want to balance that when I get those questions from them, whatever those questions might be. I want to balance being too vague with being too specific with expressive agents because I want to see how they react. They are going to react. They're going to let me know what they think. So I want to give them just enough information to figure out, how they feel and to see how they respond. And then I'm just going to play the negotiation from there off of their responses. All right. Now, if we stay on the feeler side of the quadrant, but go to the slow, patient, and more introverted corner, then we get The amiables, all right? Now, the amiables are an interesting one for me personally because a lot of how our interaction goes depends on whether they really trust me or not. If they trust me, then my skill set as a negotiator really fills in the gaps of their personality. However, if they don't trust me for whatever reason, then they are going to see my personality and negotiating style as overly pushy and aggressive. And so with amiables, I really go out of my way to not be pushy and to establish trust. Like, I really want them to feel that trust right away. And if an amiable asks me a question like, what is this house worth? I'll give them an answer, but then I'll follow it up with something like, well, what is it worth to you? Because that's the most important thing at the end of the day. Because they really aren't as interested in data as they are just in validation. And so they're either trying to validate or invalidate their feelings on a property by asking me a question like that. But really, I want them to more explore their feelings rather than trying to get external validation, right? I want them to, again, a lot of this is not, with my client, I don't want to be negotiating with my own client. What I want is to redirect our communication so that they are negotiating with themselves and figuring out what they actually want, because that's one of the biggest struggles that many clients in real estate have. And so with amiables, I really try to understand their thought process, because expressives tell you exactly what they're thinking, but amiables can keep their true thoughts close to the vest. So when there is an emotional response to something by an amiable that catches me off guard, well, I know that they haven't been completely forthright with me, because if they were, then I wouldn't have been caught off guard by their emotional reaction. So until I really know what they're thinking, I'm kind of hampered in terms of my ability to negotiate with them and to help them in the best way that I can. Now, decisiveness can be a real struggle with amiables. Whoa, I almost knocked over my ring light here. Decisiveness is frequently a struggle with amiables because they're slow to make decisions, but they also base decisions more on feelings than data. So they aren't impulsive, but they also don't have logic behind the decisions that they make when they finally do make them. So sometimes I need to be really blunt with them if they are making a mistake, but I have to be careful not to make them feel like I'm being pushy, because they don't respond well to that. So I'm going to focus more on, hey, how would you feel tomorrow if you lost out on this house, just over $5,000, right? You're not willing to come up $5,000. We know we could secure it for that amount. How would you feel tomorrow if you found out that someone else bought this house? Would you be upset about that? And then let them work through their feelings on their own without me being like, hey, I think it's a mistake for you to pass up on this house over $5,000. I want them to come to that conclusion on their own. And if they don't come to that conclusion, then that tells me that they weren't ready to make an offer on that house. Things like that, phrases like that, I will use frequently to try to get them to search their own feelings and control those feelings themselves, rather than having their feelings control their decision making 100% of the time. Now, what I really, really want to avoid with amiables is them making a decision to please me. Now, that might sound insane, for instance, for a home buyer or a home seller to make a decision specifically to please their realtor, but I have dealt with many instances where I could tell that an amiable was starting to really feel bad about how long, for instance, their search process was going, or, that they, turned down an offer that I thought was a pretty strong offer. And so I've had situations where I've started to feel like an amiable client is perhaps bordering on making an impulse decision just because they wanted to please me. And I always want to make sure I snuff that out the moment I sense it, because I'd rather them not buy or sell a house than buy or sell one to make me happy. And I'm being completely honest when I say that. It is a bad feeling when someone decides to move or do something like that and then later regret it. And if they regret it, they're likely going to blame you as the agent in some way, and I don't want that to happen. Now, there aren't a tremendous number of agents who are amiable. I've had a ton of clients who are amiable. Not a ton of agents, but there are some. And the ones who are amiable tend to be, I'm just going to be honest, pretty easy for me to negotiate with, because I know they want to avoid conflict. So I can just make suggestions for conflict avoidance that benefits my client more than them. And you'd be surprised how frequently that works, right? Because if avoiding conflict is like number one, then you might be willing to, quite frankly, sell out your client a little bit in order to avoid conflict. That's not good. I'm not saying that every amiable agent does that, but that is something that an amiable agent's going to struggle with. And from my perspective, amiable agents can be a little bit challenging to deal with if their client is a very different personality than them. For instance, I've dealt with amiable agents who are representing more driver style clients, and those negotiations can be very, very strange. Often I can tell the agent is exasperated, and sometimes they will reveal that they're exasperated, and basically they're just trying to keep the peace, but they're feeling this pressure from their clients, and they're struggling to handle it well. And so sometimes I find myself, really trying to just act like a friend or someone, a sounding board for them, someone that they can go to for validation. And if I can make them feel validated in a way that their clients don't, I can sometimes really control that negotiation because they'll feel like I'm on their side more than their client does. And again, not every amiable agent is like this. I'm not trying to make it sound like they're all bad agents, but when I figure out that I'm dealing with an amiable, immediately I'm trying to use conflict avoidance to my advantage. I'm thinking about it from that perspective. So long story short, out of all of these, amiables can be my favorite type of personality to negotiate with, and they are the ones often that I can bring the most value to as a negotiator myself, as long as I can understand what they're thinking, what the basis for their emotions is, and as long as they trust me. Now, last but not least is the quadrant where thinker and extrovert combine. In the chart that I'm looking at, it's the upper left-hand quadrant. And it's where, thinker and introvert combine for the analytical personality style. Now, an analytical is really data focused and often won't tell you much what they're thinking. These are the types of people who want to look in every attic. They want to crawl every crawl space. They want to read every contract clause, and they want to understand every step of the process, et cetera, et cetera. They are very, very into data, very, very into details, don't want surprises, want to assess everything and have tons of time to do it. And unsurprisingly, a lot of the people who are analytical are intrigued by real estate investing. But oftentimes they struggle with making their first purchase as real estate investors because they miss the forest for the trees, right? Probably the clients I've struggled with the most are this very type, the ones who are analytical and think they can be a real estate investor, but they can never get past their spreadsheets. At some point, you have to move on past the spreadsheet and say, you know what? I haven't seen a better deal than this, or this makes sense. This might not check off all 10 of my boxes, but it checks off 7 or 8 of them, and I just need to pull the trigger. So when I get a potential new investor client that seems really analytical, I immediately dive into numbers. What numbers will work or not? Is it realistic for us to even find what you're looking for? I had one recently that reached out to me, and I immediately, laid out, like, I just want to be realistic. Here's what the market's like right now. And I didn't hear back from them. They might be listening to this. I don't know. If you're listening to this, reach back out to me because I'd love to actually have more of a conversation with you. But sometimes that happens. The analyticals, once they hear the numbers, they're like, ugh, okay, yeah, that's really not going to work for me. And I save them a lot of time and effort just having that initial consult. Now, in general, if I sense I have an analytical client, my number one concern for them is knowing what are the things that they are going to analyze most thoroughly. I need to know this. If I can get a sense of what data is most important to them, then I can be a source of that data and bring some common sense to their analysis, right? Because that's what analyticals oftentimes struggle with. They struggle with common sense. They need to understand the common sense side of the transaction and not just get buried in numbers. Now, analyticals really, really don't want to feel pushed into a transaction or a negotiation. So making them feel like they're being forced into something is a really easy way to immediately lose trust with them. So when I have an analytical, I am super duper focused on providing as much data as possible before, during, and after a showing. When a showing is over, they're going to want time and space to assess their options. So I'll usually give them some advice on how much time they have. For instance, if I feel like the home will sell quickly, I'll make sure that they know that there's a potential risk with them waiting a long time. I might say, hey, there's been a lot of activity on this home. If you really like it, I wouldn't waste a whole lot of time. But I'm not going to say with them, yeah, we need to make an offer tonight. Whereas if it's like a driver that I'm talking to, I might say to the driver, you know what? Your best bet would be to make an offer tonight. And the driver is going to respond well to that. And analytical is going to push back on that. And they're simply not going to make an offer at that point because they're going to feel pressured. They're going to feel like it's a bad impulse decision and they're going to pull away. Now, my biggest struggle with analyticals is that they can sometimes get too focused on what they don't know. Why is there wood rot here? Why is there moisture in the crawl space? Why hasn't the rent been raised recently on tenants? These can all be good questions, but there will also be unanswered questions in a real estate transaction every single time. You can never answer every single question. You can never check off every single box, and you have to be okay with living with some unknowns. And analyticals tend to shut down if they have 10 questions and only get 9 of them answered, but can't get that 10th question answered. I've seen them shut down before, and that's really a shame, but it happens. Now, on the realtor side of things, there's really not a whole lot of analytical realtors, right? This is not an easy business to be both introverted and extremely analytical, extremely focused on details and just overly thinking things. But those that are, I try to show them that I can also do analysis, right? I already said I'm a driver, but I'm an analytical driver. So I can go toe-to-toe with any analytical person on data. If you don't believe me, just listen to my data-oriented podcast. I've got plenty of them, plenty of episodes where I've talked about data. So you want to argue comps with me? Fine. I'll show you the comps I used, and I'll show you exactly why I priced things the way I did. You want to overthink specific details? I'll explain to you why those details aren't as important as they're making them seem, and provide data to support why I think you're overthinking it. So these are the sorts of ways that I will approach negotiating with them. Is I will focus on, I'll turn the data back around towards them, right? If they're throwing data at me, I'm just going to be prepared with my own data and just turn it right back at them. So those are some of my thoughts on various negotiation tactics. And remember, right, I already said this before, but I think it's really important. You don't get what you deserve. You get what you negotiate. And negotiating style, it needs to be based on who the other party is. And there might be multiple parties. And I am in a fluid situation. My negotiating will change from one transaction to the next, from one party that I'm talking about to the next. It's got to be based on both parties. And if you're a driver, you think that, or if you're an expressive, you think that there's only one way to negotiate, I've got bad news for you. That's not true. And I now have a real estate negotiation expert certification to prove it. I'm just joking. Well, I do have that certification, but obviously that's not going to be the argument that I make for telling someone that I negotiate better than them. But I will say this: if you're hiring a realtor, do a lot of assessment of their negotiating ability up front, right? You don't want to hire a realtor with bad negotiating skills. And then once you hire them, trust them. Trust their ability, right? If you've already done the legwork up front, you can't be second guessing them. You don't know what's happening behind closed doors. And so make sure you think about all of that when picking out who you want to help you buy or sell your home. That's all for today's episode. Piper Insurance Group's information is in the show notes. Reach out to them for a free home, auto, or umbrella quote today. My information in the show notes if you need a realtor in the Greenville area. Like, rate, review, subscribe, all those good things for the show. And we will talk again next time.